Jane Smiley's 1,000 Acres is a fascinating revision of Shakespeare's King Lear. It tells the story of despotic landowner Larry Cook, who decides to hand over control of his 1,000 acres to his daughters. Just as in King Lear, the youngest daughter is disinherited, although a subtle difference is that Shakespeare's Cordelia seems to object to the public love-giving required before the transfer of power, whereas Smiley's Caroline has serious misgivings about the proposal itself. Following vicious arguments with the eldest two daughters, both King Lear and Larry Cook spend some time in an almighty storm and eventually die following a brief reconciliation with their favourite youngest daughters. Popular criticism of King Lear has persistently described Goneril and Regan as evil. That Bible of GCSE revision, the website sparknotes.com, goes as far as saying they are personifications of evil. They have no conscience, only appetite. How accurate is this view, and to what extent does it need to be revised following a reading of Jane Smiley's 1,000 Acres? Well, stay tuned. This is Schofield on Shakespeare. It might seem curious that an interpretation of a play, written by an Englishman in the early 1600s, could potentially be revised following a reading of a novel, written nearly 400 years later by an American woman in 1991. However, with further exploration, this approach is entirely logical. After all, the way we react to a text will depend on our own circumstances, societies, and indeed the previous texts we have read. And by extension, texts themselves change according to the context in which they are read. Take King Lear, for example. In her famous essay, The Absent Mother in King Lear, Coppelia Khan references Elizabethan views on family hierarchies to conclude that a woman's subjection to her husband's will was the measure of his patriarchal authority and thus of his manliness. And so an Elizabethan audience, brought up in a society in which male dominance was an expected norm, is likely to sympathise more and be more shocked by Lear's loss of patriarchal authority than a 21st century audience, who might feel that his behaviour was totally unacceptable in the first place. Different contexts can thus potentially alter the meaning of a text in a way the writer may not have conceived. When this text is a play, a text that is consistently subject to directorial interpretation and whim and performed live on a stage each time, it becomes a living, changeable organism that the original writer has incomplete control over. In a similar way, a text that is conspicuously a revision of another text cannot help but make us reconsider our views of that original text, especially if it is a convincing literary work. And so, to return to our existing topic, to quote Marina Leslie, the story of 1,000 Acres, if Jane Smiley's interpretation is persuasive, becomes inevitably and disturbingly the story of King Lear as well. Halfway through 1,000 Acres, Smiley includes a shocking revelation that forces us to revisit our views of the ageing patriarch Larry Cook, and if we agree with the idea that her interpretation becomes the story of King Lear as well, King Lear too. Ginny, the novel's narrator and Cook's eldest daughter, is discussing past memories with Rose, the middle daughter, following their father's furious decision to self-pityingly and melodramatically immerse himself outside in a thunderstorm. It turns out that there are memories hidden deep in her subconscious that she has repressed. Rose reveals, "Because after Daddy stopped going into you, he started coming in to me, and those are the things he said to me, and that's what we did. We had sex in my bed." Ginny initially refutes the idea that she too was abused, only for the disturbing memories to be dug out when she returns to her childhood bed in chapter 29. Lying there, I knew that he had been in there to me, that my father had lain with me on that bed, that I had looked at the top of his head at his balding spot in the brown grizzled hair while feeling him suck my breasts. Smiley's timing is deliberate. Her description of the storm's ferocity is both biblical and Shakespearean. The sky let loose a flood, not drops or sheets, but an avalanche of rain that hid my father completely from sight. Just as the strength of the storm is emphasised in Act 3, Scene 2 of King Lear, with a drama of imperative exclamations such as "Blow winds and crack your cheeks, rage blow," so Smiley likewise makes it clear that any person, especially an old stubborn man, is likely to suffer terribly, faced with such a horrendous quantity of powerful, rapid rainfall, a metaphorical avalanche. But unlike in Shakespeare, the old man's narrative and inner thoughts are not given a voice during the storm, thus reducing the potential for additional empathy. We do not hear Larry Clark wailing pitiable, highly emotive lines such as those Shakespeare allocates Lear, including "Here I stand, your slave, a poor, infirm, weak and despised old man." Instead, the narrative shifts to the perspective of the daughters and the subsequent revelations of incest, which not only pull our attention away from Larry Clark's presumed suffering outside in the storm, but force us to reconsider our impressions of his character altogether. Can his supposed gift of relinquishing control over his land still be seen as the act of a considerate father that deserves a lifetime of dutiful mothering in return, or, put simply, the very least he should offer given his past horrific abuses? This revision of Larry Clark makes us wonder about the key players in King Lear. Although I wouldn't claim that Smiley's novel somehow suggests that King Lear has committed similar abuses in the past, it does draw attention to the lack of any past history for Goneril and Regan. To quote Marina Leslie once more, "Why," this novel asks, "is it possible to wonder endlessly about Lear's motives and even Cordelia's motives, and never to ask what could have made the eldest daughters so angry?" Indeed, is Goneril merely being ruthless and conniving when she conspiratorially says to Regan at the end of Act 1, Scene 1, "You see how full of changes his age is. The observation we have made of it have not been little." Shakespeare deliberately doesn't elaborate on what these changes are, but is it not possible that Lear's latest act of dividing up his kingdom is the last in a long line of senile stunts that have driven his daughters to distraction? Are the two sisters so unreasonable in worrying about their own futures and the effect of an irrational father's behaviour on their well-being? Are they being evil in refusing to put up with his dictatorial tantrums? Smiley's revelations about incestuous child abuse forced the reader to revise their previous evaluations of Larry Cook and his daughter's treatment of him. But on a smaller yet similar scale, haven't we all experienced moments in which we've had to revise our opinion of someone based on something that has happened, been revealed or said by that person? Haven't we all experienced epiphanies in which a different, previously submerged side of a character has been exposed following an unexpected outburst or action? And so, just as Gina's shocking self-discovery causes her and the reader to reconsider her father, Lear's terrible, misogynistic, out of all proportions outbursts in King Lear must leave the audience questioning the supposedly rigid boundaries of good versus evil that form the backbone of many people's interpretations of the play. In Act 1, Scene 4, Goneril complains to her father about the behaviour of his all-licensed fool and other of your insolent retinue. She uses strong language to denounce his 100 knights and squires, men so disordered, so debauched and bold, that this our court, infected with their manners, shows like a riotous inn. There's no question that this is a significant criticism, especially towards a father whose previous response to conflict has simply been to banish, as seen twice in Act 1, Scene 1. The three adjectives, disordered, debauched and bold, alliteratively build up momentum to create a picture of men who are rude, involved in excessive drinking and or sexual behaviour. Debauched is a variant of debauched, and are creating a chaotic living environment for the rest of the palace. The simile, like a riotous inn, is a low blow, and Goneril will know that this comparison will be a terrible insult to her father, a man who has only ever lived in obsequious palaces. But a key question to ask, is it true? Are Lear's nights making life intolerable? And if so, is there any reason why she shouldn't object to their behaviour in the strongest terms? And this is where we come down to directorial interpretation. Shakespeare gives no prescriptive stage directions as to what extent Lear's knights should be behaving unacceptably whilst on stage. In Act 1, Scene 3, Goneril complains privately to her steward Oswald of their behaviour, and they are present on stage within Goneril's palace for the first time in Act 1, Scene 4, during which stage Lear himself strikes Oswald, and then a disguised Kent trips him up. If the director chooses to have a small quantity of knights on stage at this point, generally showing good-humoured restraint, then we might conclude that Goneril is being unfair and is simply looking for an excuse to belittle her father. However, repeated productions and reworkings of the play have spotlighted the inevitable problems that can ensue when you have the extraordinary number of an additional 100 men squeezed into a new environment. Listen to the racket and chaos caused by Lear's men in Peter Brooks's 1971 production as they amble in anticipating dinner. Just before Lear leaves the castle, doesn't their behaviour here suggest Goneril was right to suggest that their continuing presence was untenable? Would you want this lot in your house? In Kurosawa's Ran, it is likewise clear that the ageing warlord's retinue are rowdy and not conducive to good order and morality. There may not be 100 knights or warriors, but they still make themselves heard.
その数は少なくとも、その振る舞いは目に余ります。あの歌は何事でござります。父上、これでは太郎、下の者に示しがつきます。
荒武者どもだ。領事様はここらへん。ざれ言もたまには申すわ。
ざれ言にも程がござる。
In Christopher Moore's crude novel version of the play, Fool, the narrator develops the idea of the logistical problems of having 100 knights, and in doing so sheds insight into our reaction to Goneril's criticism. He writes, with the Fool as narrator, "When Lear pronounced that we would be accompanied by 100 knights, it was not as if 100 men could mount up and ride out of the gates at sunrise. Each knight, the unlanded second or third son of a noble, would have at least one squire, a page, usually a man to tend his horses, and sometimes a man at arms. Each had at least one warhorse, a massive armoured beast." In any case, Lear's reaction to Goneril's criticisms, whether they are fair or unfair, or in all likelihood something in the middle, reveal a disturbing misogyny deep within his character, which force us to re-evaluate the boundaries of good and evil in the play. "Degenerate bastard!" he roars, thereby hinting that Goneril is the offspring of illegitimate lust rather than his own flesh and blood. And remember, this would have been a far more significant insult in the early 1600s, in which children born out of wedlock would have been stigmatised, hence the apparently inexplicable machinations of Shakespearean characters such as Edmund in King Lear and Don John in Much Ado About Nothing. But he gets worse.
Hear nature. Hear, dear goddess, hear. Suspend thy purpose, if thou didst intend to make this creature fruitful. Into her womb convey sterility. Dry up in her the organs of increase, and from her delicate body never spring a babe to honor her.
This is a truly appalling diatribe, and one which pinpoints the only area in which an Elizabethan woman may feel that she has some control, her fertility. What I find interesting are the references to the female body. It is derogate, not worthy of respect, whilst the womb should become sterile and unable to reproduce. Her organs should be dried up, and these repeated references to the female body hint at a broader discomfort with female sexuality per se. This is confirmed in Act 4, Scene 6, when Lear suggests that female sexuality is uncontrollable, insatiable, and even worse, that these desires are subversively hidden. He declares, "The fitune or the soiled horse goes to it with a more riotous appetite. Down from the waist they are centaurs, though women all above." A fitune was a polecat, a small, fierce, wild animal with a strong, unpleasant smell. In Shakespeare's time, it would have also been a slang term for a prostitute. Centaurs are mythical creatures with a human's upper body and the lower body and legs of a horse. And both these images suggest that there is something essentially dangerous and wild about the female appetite for sex, which Lear declares is riotous. Lear's unfortunate experiences at the hand of his daughters has resulted in exposing deeply held feelings of fear about the relatively unknown capabilities of female sexuality, something, in spite of his previous power, he has little or no understanding of and utterly no control. Horses have the potential to kick out violently, and if horses' legs do indeed represent the vagina, the male penis in particular is left extraordinarily vulnerable. I would argue that Lear's language forces us to re-examine him as a character, and in particular as a father. Shakespeare, unlike Jane Smiley, doesn't give us any information about the relationship between the father and his daughters before power is redistributed. But the fact Lear resorts so quickly to curses which strike at the very heart of female identity and, arguably within Elizabethan context, their very purpose, and then uses these experiences to condemn the entire female sex for being out of control wild nymphomaniacs, must suggest that he has no understanding of his daughters, and therefore has been at best clueless and at worst utterly inadequate and a frequently hostile father. Smiley allocates Larry Cook a similarly misogynistic diatribe in 1,000 Acres. During a tense confrontation, just before he petulantly heads off into the storm, Larry leans his face towards his eldest daughter and narrator Gina to scream, "You barren whore! I know all about you, you slut! But you're not really a woman, are you? I don't know what you are. Just a bitch, that's all. Just a dried up whore bitch." Whereas Lear's words resonate long in the memory due to Shakespeare's poetic imagery, Smiley deliberately makes Larry's language as crude and vulgar as possible, because that's what he is, an unpleasant, coarse little man. And to return to the idea that the story of 1,000 Acres is in some way the story of King Lear, then should we as discerning critics be able to see through the grandeur of Lear's magnificent poetry to the real man lurking behind? This essay started by asking, just how evil are Goneril and Regan? Well, Smiley's transposition of the King Lear story to the modern day forces us to revise previous preconceptions of the evil sisters. Because 1,000 Acres is written from a female perspective, we realise the potential unreliability and flaws of a uniquely male perspective, and this is surely summed up in the lack of soliloquies dished out to either Goneril or Regan. Because 1,000 Acres presents the Goneril and Regan equivalents, Gina and Rose, as not perfect, but three-dimensional characters with an unhappy past home life with their father, we can't help but wonder whether Shakespeare's eldest two sisters may be more justified in the way they treat their father than we previously gave them credit for. A reading of 1,000 Acres also emphasises the importance of revisiting previous opinions of characters based on later events and revelations. Given Lear so readily resorts to verbal abuse of his children, in hindsight were Goneril and Regan perfectly entitled and indeed wise to preempt his departure? Perhaps tragedy is all the more powerful when the boundaries of good and evil are so explicit. But in King Lear's case, as this essay has argued, it is simply wrong and inaccurate to dismiss Goneril and Regan as, to quote SparkNotes.com, personifications of evil. This has been a Schofield on Shakespeare production exploring misogyny in King Lear and 1,000 Acres. Thanks for watching.